Jimmy Carter, who I mean, he's a fascinating former president. And he's fascinating because for a couple of reasons. One is because, you know, he did some really good things as president. He did amazing things was way ahead of the curve on sustainable energy, on and really did have a wariness of military intervention and a concern for human rights, which does seem unparalleled. Now, he's still the president. He still has a job to do. So you could either say, look, he had to deal with the world as it was, or if you have a more critical view of, foreign policy, which, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So it wasn't like, he did back the Shah. He did, was actually instrumental in beginning our policy in Afghanistan, which funded the Mujahideen to help repel the Soviets. But I got to tell you, that policy actually, from that standpoint in history, made a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. But the thing that's fascinating is that everybody has kind of jumped on this whole he was a terrible president bandwagon. Obviously, I can't really comment specific. I wasn't even alive. But clearly the extent to which he's a terrible president has been incredibly exaggerated, considering the fact that he was right about so much and ahead of the curve on so much. Wasn't nearly as liberal as people remember him. He was actually domestically more in the Democratic Leadership Council kind of more conservative Democrat domestic mold, probably by today's standards, making him quite liberal. But then in his post-presidency, he's done all of the service work, but he's also been very willing to be a serious critic of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, which I'll get to in a second. And it is for that reason that I think Jimmy Carter is convinced, and he said this past weekend in an interview, I think on Meet the Press, that he thinks he is being monitored by the NSA. Let's play that sound.
As a matter of fact, I have felt that my own communications were probably monitored. And when I want to communicate with a foreign leader privately, I type or write the letter myself, put it in the post office, and mail it.
Old-fashioned snail mail.
Yeah, because I believe if I send an email, it will be monitored.
So first of all, I have no idea how anybody could doubt Jimmy Carter thinking that, given everything we know. And even if we didn't know that, Jimmy Carter is a former president who's done some very controversial work from the perspective of the national security establishment. So any kind of frame that, that's Jimmy Carter's crazy, he's off his rocker or something, is nonsense. I think it's incredibly unlikely he's not being monitored by the NSA. So I think he's totally right to take whatever precautions he thinks he should take. And I was just reminded, I just want to kind of call back to this really briefly, because I was reminded when he said that they were talking about broader trends in U.S. security policy. And Jimmy Carter, in the summer of 2012, wrote a column for the New York Times. This is the summer of the election. And, Jimmy Carter's, loyal Democrat, supported President Obama. But he wrote a piece for the New York Times called A Cruel and Unusual Record. And he said, quote, "The United States is abandoning its role as a global champion of human rights." Now, okay, we of course could debate that assertion. But listen to this. "Revelations that top officials are targeting people to be assassinated abroad, including American citizens, are only the most recent and disturbing proof of how far our nation's violations of human rights have extended. This development began after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and have been sanctioned and escalated by a bipartisan executive and legislative actions without the dissent of the general public. As a result, our country can no longer speak with moral authority on these critical issues." He goes on to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, goes on. Then he says, "Recent legislation has made it legal that the president's right to detain a person indefinitely on suspicion of affiliation with a terrorist organization or, quote, associated forces, a broad, vague power that can be abused without meaningful oversight from the courts or Congress." The law violates the right of freedom of expression and the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, two other rights enshrined in our Constitution. He goes on to talk about policy in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and the Surveillance Act. And I just think it just really bears noting that Jimmy Carter is the only person of equivalent position in public life who is willing to speak out in the way he's willing to speak out. So anytime he comes forward, I think that we need. I think it's a national task that we have to take on to rehabilitate Jimmy Carter, defend Jimmy Carter, because he's. I mean, it's also an amazing lesson the way that even a guy who is president can get marginalized and dissociated with some kind of sense and imagined notion of failure or being outside of the margins. Well, where he's been outside of the margins, whether it's on energy, climate, human rights, he happens to be right and clearly conducts himself with a lot of integrity. And the last thing I'll say about Jimmy Carter is they asked him once what the biggest failure of his presidency was, and he said letting Ronald Reagan get elected president. How can you not love that man? What a shofar for Jimmy Carter.